marvelous message we bring, glorious carol we sing, wonderful word of the King, Jesus is coming again.
Welcome back to Truth and Reason as we continue our discussions through our latest study that we began last week as we finish up our lessons on a survey of the Bible. Thank you for joining me on these studies. I will have the questions on screen and we'll just kind of go through them in regard to the scriptures that are given. But as I've said before, if you have any questions or additional answers that you would like to see addressed, email those to me and we can discuss those together in a future study. Our remaining lessons and where we picked up last week and left off was in lesson 8, and we are covering faith demands works. So this may take us a little while to get through the remainder of the lessons. A lot of great material here, and of course we are going to be in the book of John. As we look at faith demanding works, there are a lot of things that kind of prelude to that particular point, and we'll get into chapter 2 probably in the next lesson or so. But today we've gotten as far as the first 8 verses of chapter 1. And the next section of the lessons is entitled A Contrast of Brothers, the Lowly to the Rich, from verses 9 through 11 in James chapter 1. So let's read that, then we'll get into the questions. James 1, 9 through 11 says, "Let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation, but the rich in his humiliation. Because as a flower of the field he will pass away, for no sooner has the sun risen with the burning heat than it withers with the grass. Its flower falls, and its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits." You know, when you look at people who like to criticize often the book of James, especially in regard to I'll just say the Calvinists that try to throw out the idea that we're saved by works. Even James begins in this prelude to works of the fact that here are people that really count on their works for their salvation, but in the wrong way. So there's a right way and there's a wrong way as we seek salvation in God's Word. And I've quoted many times from Ephesians chapter 2, and looking at verse 10 in particular, that when you look at the preceding verses that talk about grace and faith, all these things are culminated in the fact that we are the workmanship of God, created to do His works. And so in summation, it's about doing the works of God and not our own. So a rich man can't be saved because of his riches, because of any kind of glory that he has while he's here on this earth. But a lowly brother doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about somebody in poor or in poverty, but we're talking about somebody who's rich in spirit, that does not count on the earthly treasures or even the earthly works for his salvation. You may be a good person. I hear this from people a lot of times. They count on their salvation because they're good people. They do have a good sense of morality in many cases. But you see, that's not God's plan of salvation. That's certainly a characteristic that we should have according to God's plan of salvation. But when it comes down to it, you're not going to be saved by your own personal works. You're not going to be saved by the fact that you're just a good person. If you are without Christ, you're still in sin, no matter how good your morals may be. So we must humble ourselves. When we think about a lowly brother, we're talking about somebody that sure, from a practical standpoint, might not have as much as the rich man. He may not have as much going for him in this physical life, but he's humble. And he knows that his true riches are in the Lord. As Jesus said, lay your treasure in heaven. We'll go back to this verse in just a moment. So let's begin at looking at the comparison of these two. When we think about the term brother, it's often associated with those in the brotherhood, those in fellowship. This, of course, includes, sisters in Jesus Christ. Don't think that when you read through the Bible and you find the terminology about men and the works of men, sometimes there is a distinction between men and women, and that is found in the Scripture in the context. But when we're talking about brothers here, we're talking about the brotherhood of Christ. And so he's given the example here. What is the lowly brother to glory? And of course, as we read just a moment ago, the lowly brother will glory in his exaltation. What we are not exalted with in this life, certainly as the Lord has taught us, we will have our riches in heaven. And when we have that glory, if you will, as Jesus in that home in heaven, that's the greatest exaltation that we can have. It's not about power. It's not about prestige. And no matter what our trials are in this life, things are going to be wonderful in a home in heaven with God. And so we need to prepare ourselves for that. We need to make sure that we are in obedience to God, doing His will while we're here, and live with the goal of getting to heaven, knowing that what happens to us in this flesh is not the determination of our soul salvation. I see a lot of people who go through trials in life and they want to blame God for it. Job is, of course, a great example of this when you look at the fact that he never cursed God. He never blamed God. And although God allowed Satan to work various evil works in Job's life, it certainly taught Job a perspective about God, because God trusted in Job that he would never turn against him, whereas almost everybody else did, in Job's life, even down to his wife, the doubtings of his friends. I mean, there's just a whole list of, those that even Job himself, who didn't quite comprehend the great nature of God, we can learn from those examples ourselves. So humility is at the very heart of the lesson here, and we will be exalted, if you will. And so the next question deals with what is the rich to glory and why. Of course, as we read, the rich in his humiliation. One of the things that we have to realize about no matter what kind of prestige we're looking for in this life is that at some point we are going to be humbled. And it is much better for us to humble ourselves of our, choice, of our own fruition, of knowing and humbling ourselves to God's authority and not our own. There are a lot of people that have a lot of power in this world today, and just to be honest about it, a lot of people with power have a lot of money, they have a lot of riches, they have a lot of authority. You see this among the rich, you see it in government, politics, and things of this nature. You take those elements away, though, what is a man? And a man should be judged by his character and who he is, good or bad. And that's how God is going to judge us in the end, by the character and the way that we lived according to his will. And of course, he goes on to say, for no sooner than the sun has risen with a burning heat than it withers the grass. Its flower falls, its beautiful appearance perishes. It's just showing us the frailties of this life. So whatever you count on in this life, we will come to humility. As the Bible says, every knee shall bow. And when do we want that to be? While we're here in this life, humbling ourselves before God, or when we are made to humble in the day of judgment, when our fate, if you will, has been sealed. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to choose for? What is our ambition in this life? What is our goal? And so, whereas many will say, yeah, they're not saved by their works, as we'll see in James chapter 2, why is it that many believe they can pay for their salvation? Why do they think that they can work for their salvation with prestige, honor, and glory while they're here in this life? And a lot of people look at things that they have and say, well, God must be blessing me, so I must be doing something right. And we forget to humble ourselves in the sight of God. We forget about his mercy, his grace, and the fact that what we do have, we can't say that we deserve. It's not about patting ourselves on the back, but it's about being grateful and giving God thanks. Well, let's look at temptation. And we talked about this a bit last week as we looked at the first lesson in dealing with the things needed to overcome temptation, to face temptation. And so the writer here says in verses 12 through 18, blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. All right, let's look at how we can break this down through the questions that are asked. The facts of temptation. Number 7 in the lesson is, in what way is the one who endures temptation blessed? And of course, when we just look at these passages and we see that blessed is the man who endures temptation, because the blessing comes after the fact that he has been proved. Here's a person that has overcome temptation. He's faced temptation. He's not let temptation get the better of him. But he, as we talked about in the previous verses, is lowly in his humility toward God, and he's looking for the great riches of heaven. And that's where we must lay our riches, of course, a treasure, as the Lord has said. So it says he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. So there's your key point of loving the Lord. When you love the Lord, you're doing his will. You're following him, and you are obeying his will. So blessed is that man. And of course, we have the example of Jesus, who was tempted in every point as we are. But he never sinned. And that's what is being talked about here of the sinful temptations that are out there. How many times have we given in to sinful temptations, therefore causing up a wall of separation between ourselves and God? And so when we overcome, and don't think, as is pointed out here, that you're tempted by God. We can never blame God for the things going on in this life. We see things in this life all the time. And that doesn't mean that because something is present in your life that you are to be a partaker of it. It doesn't mean that because things are legal in your country, that you are allowed to partake. There's a lot going on in our world, in our society today, of which many sinful practices have become legal, but that doesn't make it right for God's people. And we answered this question, of course, but does God tempt anyone? And how is one tempted? Again, let's look at that verse 13 through 14, when he says, let no one say when he's tempted, I'm tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. God has a standard. And we need to have that standard as well. We need to let our word be our bond, and that we're not going to give ourselves over to the way of Satan. God cannot be tempted by evil, so he's not tempting us with evil. God doesn't put evil out there to cause us to trip up, to cause us to fall. God's not out there waiting for us to mess up. There's a lot of people that really believe that in this world today. They look at the trials they go through and they say, oh, this is just God putting me to the test. No. God didn't put Job to the test. Satan did. And God gives us the free will. We want free will, don't we? We want the free will to be able to go and make our own decisions in this life. God is manipulating no one. We are not his puppets on a string. Now, as a Christian, sometimes I would like him to manipulate my circumstances, certainly, but that's not how it works. And we have to make choices of our own accord to be faithful to him. Because as verse 14 says, but each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. So you have to ask yourself the question, what are my desires? Okay. There are people that they start off with wrong desires sometimes. In fact, sometimes those are the things that bring us to the Lord, because we're done with our world of sin. We realize this is not going to save us. I'm in a bad place here. I need God in my life. With that in mind, we turn to God and we receive forgiveness of our sins. You'll find that over time, your desire for sin is less as you get older, as you get more mature. And, the things as you get older, you look back on and say, why did I ever desire that to begin with? And this is why people struggle so much with their faith, is because they haven't let go of that desire for sin. There's something in their life that is still pulling them away from God. And that's why it makes it so hard for them to be faithful to him. I mean, honestly, come up with a different answer. I'd love to hear it. Because each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. And let me tell you something, this is how Satan works in your life. He's using those very things that you want, that you desire, that you see with the eye. Look in the ways that he has tempted men over time. Job is a bit of an exception in regard to some of the physical things that literally happened to him, but you look at the very first commission of sin of Eve partaking of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that came from a conversation with Satan, the serpent of old. That came from a conversation of one that said, look at that fruit. See how great it looks? And that's what our world is doing for us. They're selling sin as a beautiful thing. And we have to be careful. God isn't doing this to us. And God doesn't just put something in front of our face and tells us, here, look on its beauty, but you can't touch it. In everything that you're probably tempted by in life, there's probably a way to obtain the pleasure of that thing. For instance, he said the bed is undefiled in marriage. So God encourages a relationship between a man and a woman, but in the right way. Not in the godly, filthy way that the world does it today. In fact, marriage was the first institution, if you will, that God established when he created man and woman and put them together in the bonds of marriage. Well, those are ways that we can overcome, is do things in the right way, and you'll have joy in this life. You don't need to take pleasure in the sinful things. Let's look at another point. Number 9, describe the relationship of temptation to lust, that is desires, of lust to sin, and of sin to death. Well, the best way to do that is just to read the passage. Look at verse 15. Kind of sums it up right here. Then when desire has conceived. Remember, going back to verse 14, this is your own desires. The things that you want, the things that somewhere in your mind are rattling around saying, I have a need for this. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. So desire causes men to seek after things they should not. And it goes against their conscience. It goes against what they know that they should be doing. Apply yourself to doing better things. I always like to say, there are better things to do, better places to do them with, and in a lot of cases, better people to surround yourself with. And we need the influence of good in our lives so that we can overcome sin. It's not just about saying no to sin, it's about saying yes to God. But he goes on to say, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. One of the greatest deceptive things about sin is it tells you that things are okay. It lets you take pleasure in sin. And that term comes from Hebrews chapter 11, when you look at the example of Moses, when it said that he chose to suffer with his people than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, because he had everything in Egypt. He was the adoptive son of the Pharaoh's daughter. So he had everything in the world his heart could possibly desire. Money, prestige, authority, and so on. But he gave that all up because he saw that relationship separated him from God, from his people who were the people of God. So ultimately, sin leads to death. It may give you pleasure for a while, but ultimately it leads to death. And then, of course, he concludes in verse 16 by saying, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. One more question. Number 10. Who is the source of every good and perfect gift? And how does that affect that which is stated in verse 18? Let's read that. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. What an encouraging passage it is to know that we can have, by the divine authority and revelation of God in his word, he does not change. Sin is always trying to convince you in various ways. Sin is always, if one thing doesn't work, Satan's going to throw something else at you. We're constantly going to be bombarded from every side to give into temptation of sin. But with God, there's one, as the Bible calls it, straight and narrow path. That's the path you want to be on. and it will give you the true satisfaction of the exaltation of riches in heaven. And this is what God has designed for us, His people, so that we can have hope and salvation, that we might be a kind of first fruits of His creatures. He gave His word, He revealed it, and we live in the latter days today of a generation since Jesus Christ of everything that led to that point, that we might be saved. A couple friends of mine had made some comments about this when I asked them about the first fruits, and Brother Bob Myhan said the gospel had only just begun to produce fruit. And then Brother Terry Benton, I work with these men on a program called Answering Religious Error, and he expounds on it a little bit more, where he says, it seems that in the context that all converts in the first century were first of many expected to come as the gospel of grace created many more creatures of grace for ages to come. And you can go back and read Ephesians 2, 7 through 10, which we've quoted some portions of that on this program. He says, we are creatures or creations of His workmanship through the gospel of grace. How encouraging that should be to us, to know that we are a part of that, that everything that God has done through His word is for our salvation. Jesus being the first to be raised from the dead, and so we in turn will rise to be with Him for forever in eternity. Well, the next time we'll talk about James chapter 2. And the two topics in particular is the respect of persons, and then, of course, the relationship of faith and works. So as I said before, if you have any questions, please let me know. Be happy to address those on this program, because there may be things that you have written down in your lessons in addition to what we've talked about today. And so looking forward to hearing your answers. We appreciate the study, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Truth and Reason.
Coming again, coming again. Oh, what a wonderful day it will be. Jesus is coming.